My name is Seneca Vaught. I'm a professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University, and I teach people how to use history. I'm really interested in applied history. How do you take lessons from the past? How do you think creatively, critically, and historically about issues in the present? And how do you make it real to the day-to-day experience of people? So Juneteenth is a party, and I like to party. So that's on the surface level. Everyone loves holidays, and Juneteenth is a holiday that we're celebrating, I think, one of the most quintessential American themes, which is liberty. What particularly interests me about this topic is in recent years, celebrations that are coded to be Black have become more controversial. And I think as a researcher, I want to know why that is so, what underlying historical currents have contributed to this moment, have contributed to these tensions. But I think most importantly, what can we learn to apply to our lives, our lived reality going forward, to make the holiday something more than just a celebration, but perhaps something that brings people closer together. So the most interesting thing that I found in the course of my research regarding Juneteenth is just thinking about it outside of the geographical framework of Texas or boundaries of Texas, and to really think about how universal the idea of Jubilee is, how universal the idea of emancipation is, not only within the borders of the United States, but globally. Thinking about the ways that freed persons were communicating with each other through celebration, through song, through messaging, through ideas, and really thinking about how those ideas can shape and inform the things that we do today. A key part of that, I think about, and I've repeated this phrase, concretizing the idea of freedom. Like, how does it manifest in the lived experience of people? What type of land do we occupy? How do we share resources? How do we make the lived experience of being an American easier for people to understand and to appreciate the history of this nation? So all of those themes, I think, are tied up in the idea of Juneteenth and Jubilee. How about you?
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum. My name is Trey Gaines. I'm director of the museum, and we're glad to have you out this afternoon for our special lecture. Before we get started, let me give a couple of upcoming announcements. I will invite everyone to silence your cell phones, please.
Oh, that's a good idea.
I'm going to tell you this announcement, but I'm going to share the bad news with you. We have camp next week for what age?
8 to 12.
8 to 12-year-olds. Well, we already have too many, so it's closed. But it's Myths of Many Lands, and Dorsey's going to have a great time with them next week. We do have two other camps though coming up in July. July 6th through July 10th, Quantum Quest. And July 20th through July 24th, It's Revolutionary. There are two summer camp opportunities we have in July. If you've got kids, grandkids, neighbor kids, or just kids you know that need to come somewhere, we'll take them. Registration on our website. Next week, next Thursday night, is our next evening lecture. Mary Norton will be here to give an encore presentation of her talk on Alphabet Collins. If you all came out to the April lecture where we opened this exhibit on the other side of this wall that night, she gave a lecture, but she was only able to give about 15 minutes of her 45 to 60-minute lecture. So come again if you even came out that night. She's got a lot of great information to share about Alphabet Collins and the Georgia Institute of Genetics, the building of which you see out there on the campus of Georgia Highlands. On Monday, June 29th, we have a barn quilt painting workshop, and there are a few more slots left in that class if you're interested. Go online and purchase your ticket and select the design of the barn quilt that you want to paint. In the next several days, we'll be sending out announcements and invitations to a special event that we've got coming up in July. At the end of July, on July 23rd, we're going to open our next temporary exhibit called Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. It's a traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian Institute, and we're going to be hosting that exhibit for 6 weeks. And along with that exhibit, we've got a whole host of programming to go along with it while it's here at the History Museum. We're co-sponsoring that event with the Summer Hill Museum with Alexis Callahan, who's my co-partner on that. So be looking for that announcement and all those details for that exhibit. All right, well, without further ado, let's get to our main attraction today. I'm pleased to welcome and announce Dr. Seneca Vaught, who is a professor of history at Kennesaw State University. He is an interdisciplinary scholar who works at the intersection of culture and policy. His work emphasizes integrating historical methods and community engagement, historical preservation, and public policy projects. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vaught.
Thank you, Trey, and thank you to the staff here at the museum for being awesome, amazing hosts. And I'm most grateful to you for giving up your Wednesday. I see a couple of my students in the audience as well, so I'm grateful to them for coming as well. I'm really excited this year about history. This is a big year for history, as many of you know. And I think I'm at the right crowd. I think I'm positioned before the right crowd to talk history today. So in my very brief overview of Juneteenth and its history, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to engage in a much longer discussion at the end of my talk about some of the themes that I'll share with you. I've entitled this particular lecture, Juneteenth Grounds for Celebration. And what I'm hoping to accomplish is that we'll get a better understanding overall of the immediate origin, so to speak, the traditional origins of how Juneteenth was discussed. And then we'll move into how, in particular, the holiday evolved amidst other heritage holidays and how the context of those other holidays influenced how we think and reflect on the celebration itself. And throughout, we'll compare the importance of the holiday's historical themes, how it was practiced, its original intentions, and its ongoing relevance. And I will consistently use the term groundings or being grounded in reference to particular practices of the holiday itself, as well as what it meant. So the story for us begins, as you may be aware, with a general order from Major General Gordon Granger that he issues in Galveston, Texas in 1865. It reads, "The people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." So this is the proclamation that was given that many people then have extrapolated. The celebrations ensued that it had taken 2.5 years of the word of the Emancipation Proclamation to reach Galveston, Texas, in this proclamation of the General Gordon Granger. And as we reflect on that, we think that, well, we know that the 2.5 years that it took for the message to arrive was not an issue of people not having heard, not knowing, but really an issue of power, an issue of force. They had heard in many instances what was happening, but there was no force present to make that proclamation a reality. So oftentimes when we think about the context of slavery and abolition in the 19th century and prior, we think of it as people living in pocket communities, cut off entirely from the world. But there's a great book that I highly recommend called The Common Wind that talks about in the 17th and 18th century, there were circuits of information that were every bit as effective, perhaps less destructive, than our contemporary social media platforms, where through a network of sailors, as well as just word of mouth, the African diaspora was connected and was able to know of developments as far away as Haiti and the western coast of Africa. And, you know, it's kind of like a game sometimes that you may play with your kids where you whisper something in one's ear and it goes around. Sometimes the message would come out a little bit distorted, but there was clearly an existing information network. I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I'm doing that because I want us to accomplish two things as we think about emancipation and how it relates to Juneteenth and our concerns today. And the first is that I would like us to move away from the uniquely celebratory tone of Juneteenth that we may be accustomed to, and to think more about Juneteenth as grounded in the idea of Jubilee. For many of you, you have heard of the text in the Bible in Leviticus 25 that proclaims a year of Jubilee every 50th years after a cycle of 7 years, when God commanded the Israelites to release all slaves, cancel all debts, let the land rest, and to return ancestral property to its original owners. And at the core of this message of Jubilee, which was what the original Juneteenth celebration was called, a year later in 1866, they referred to it as Jubilee. It was implicit and explicit in the expectation that freedom equaled access to land and economic empowerment. Those two were inseparable in the mind of the formerly enslaved, as well as in the mind of abolitionists who advocated for them. So I'm going to read a little, I'll talk a little in between, and all in preparation for, I hope, a conversation that we can have at the end. And an address in Rochester on December 26 of 1862, Frederick Douglass declared the coming of a true Jubilee. A decade earlier, in his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," Douglass contrasted the nation's Jubilee shouts with the mournful wail of millions, unquote. Now in 1862, on the eve of emancipation, Douglass reminded the nation of the responsibility to not only emancipate, but to truly liberate as a collective responsibility to uplift the marginalized. In 1851, Douglass was well aware of the delegation of free blacks that had gone to the island of Haiti to learn and to discuss the prospects of emancipation. They were offered free land there by Haiti's then emperor, Faustin Soulouque, though they declined the offer. In this picture here, you see an abolitionist to the right named Henry Clay Works. He was a white abolitionist from New York, but he also saw the need to articulate Jubilee as a central theme of these celebrations. He's focused primarily in popular culture to challenge the idea of freedom then, and it still resonates today in a way that went against the propaganda of what freedom meant to enslaved persons. He specifically took aim at the works of Stephen Foster, whose minstrel songs emphasized the paternalism and benevolent nature of old, quote unquote, pappy masters. Henry Clay Works composed a song, "Freedom Coming." And in that song, he attempted to present a more accurate characterization of Black sentiments towards Jubilee in the mainstream. Unfortunately, the song did come with many of the characteristics of the minstrel genre at that time, but it conveyed a clear message of freedom from the perspective of those who were enslaved. The lyrics were later adapted by Peter Seeger and modified for a modern audience, but they were celebrated during that time for acknowledging the centrality of justice and grounding the sentiments of a free generation in lyrical form. This is an excerpt from the song as it had been updated by Peter Seeger. "Now folks all feel so lonesome living in the log house on the lawn. They move their things to master's parlor for to keep it while he's gone. There's wine and cider in the kitchen, and you and me will have some. I suppose they'll be confiscated when the Lincoln soldiers come." The chorus, "The master run, ha ha, and we will stay, ho ho. It must be now the kingdom's coming in the year of Jubilee." And just in that brief excerpt of the song, you hear two hints at the nature of what jubilation and Jubilee meant. It was a celebratory tone, but it was also a restorative tone. In a playful tone, it it communicated the ideas of a transformation of position, an affirmation of power, and an articulation of responsibility. Jubilee through the eyes of former slave by the name of Henry Highland Garnett that you see here are also interesting to think about Juneteenth and to ground it and what it meant during that time. Garnett was a formerly enslaved person that lived in New York that wrote a sermon that was loosely based on the theme of Jubilee. It was referred to as many things over the years, but he became most famous for a version of it that he presented before the U.S. House of Representatives in 1865. The title of that speech, "Let the Monster Perish." In that speech, he alludes to the themes of freedom, the themes of Jubilee, the themes of emancipation, but it's not simply a celebratory tone. It's a tone that describes slavery as a monster that has destroyed not only the capacity for Blacks to have self-autonomy, but the autonomy for the ability rather for the nation to govern itself. If we were to take a step back even further and to retrace the origins of Juneteenth, it would take us through a global history, one that begins not in 1865 with Gordon Granger's General Order Number 3, but in 1804, as Haiti becomes the first state founded by former slaves who explicitly and strategically used the language of the French and American revolutions to justify their rights as equal and brothers under law. We might also want to think about the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade enshrined in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the American Constitution, prohibiting the migration, quote, or importation of such persons before 1808. Or perhaps the British slave trade of abolition of the slave trade of 1807, that all vessels containing contraband of enslaved persons would be confiscated and released by the British Navy. Perhaps that's where we want to begin our discussion of Emancipation Day, or as I've already alluded to, perhaps with the already famous Emancipation Proclamation written by Abraham Lincoln that sat in his desk for a couple of months during the summer of 1862. It became formally enacted in January of the following year, but there's also other aspects to this story that can help us get to the official holiday of Juneteenth and to ground it more in both the material, the political, and the economic conditions of those who celebrate it. I call these grounds for celebration because these stories hint at some other points of contention on our timeline. As you see, the first annual celebration of Jubilee occurred in Galveston and Houston concurrently in 1866, a year after General Gordon Granger's famous General Order Number 3. But it was also marked by less than a decade later when the collective purchase of land for Emancipation Park by freedmen and the population of Texas and Houston occurred in 1872. So a little bit more to think about on that. 4 formerly enslaved Black men, Jack Yates, a Reverend, Richard Allen, Richard Brooke, Elias Dibble, pulled together $800. Again, these were 4 formerly enslaved persons who, in that same generation, were able to pull together $800. Now, I know the rent is high in Cartersville and Atlanta, so that might not seem much to you. But in 1872, that amounted to about $22,000. Quite a feat for someone who had exclusively been owned by another person a little more than a decade prior. They did that to buy 10 acres of land in Houston's 3rd Ward. They wanted to establish a park. In doing so, this park became a site for the celebration for Houston's Blacks and all those who celebrated emancipation. But they also did something that was quite revolutionary and groundbreaking. It was the first public park created in the history of the state of Texas. So it was a defiant act of purchasing land and using that land to promote the interest of freedom. It was an action that was not merely a fleeting celebration, but physically grounded in location through the purchase of soil as an expression of freedom. These actions were followed by free blacks in the city of Austin who pursued similar strategies. The next year and throughout the 20th century, throughout a period that we refer to as a period of great trials. Some historians like Rayford Logan have referred to it as the nadir. We see Juneteenth breaking out of the depths of kind of being a local phenomenon, a celebration, and spreading throughout other parts of the region, only to be countered by a force that we'll get to in a moment that had an alternative vision for what freedom should entail and how it should be celebrated. But yet again, if we look at Juneteenth from another perspective, instead of focusing entirely on the proclamation aspect or the celebratory aspects, and perhaps if we look outside of the realm of Texas, the geographical boundary of Texas, we can see yet another dimension of the holiday. So let's do that. Those are the pictures of those four men being celebrated in Houston: Richard Allen, Elias Dibble, Richard Brock, and John Henry Yates. It's a current picture of Emancipation Park. It's received quite a bit of an update. But back to this theme, if we were to expand now our discussion beyond the geographical confines of Texas, what could we find? We see two men here. On the left, Gordon Granger, Major General Gordon Granger, and on the right, someone who's quite famous in the Atlanta area, General William Tecumseh Sherman. So let's talk about these two men, their proclamations, and how their words played into both the celebratory tone as well as the grounding of the Juneteenth holiday. Let's begin with Granger, who we've already introduced. His field order number 3 had a primary purpose to announce and enforce the emancipation in Texas, which was the last Confederate state to receive the news. If we were to do a deeper dive into the text that I read a little bit earlier, he declares freedom of all enslaved people. However, we see that he places significant restrictions on this newfound freedom, requiring, this is not a suggestion, requiring newly emancipated persons to stay in their present homes, slave cabins, and to enter into labor contracts with their former masters. I have good news and I have bad news for you. The good news is you're free. The bad news is you're not that free because you can't go anywhere. Another way to think about this is we know the number one thing that most enslaved persons wanted to do in the Deep South upon hearing news of freedom was to leave. Why? They wanted to be reunited with their friends and family who had been sold off, mothers who had their children sold, fathers who had been separated from their wives, children who had been separated from their mother. So there was this massive remigration, this resettling, where people were going everywhere. People who had made it as far as Canada came back to be reunited. And we have various newspaper articles, and William Still, who during the Underground Railroad had operated kind of as an information hub. Abolitionists like him had taken on a new role in helping families be reconnected. So what grounds is it to celebrate if one cannot be reunited with one's family? If freedom is worth attaining and fighting for, it's not just some rhetorical or intellectual exercise. We are free because of the associations and our right to be with the ones who we love. So it kind of, I soured the pot. I apologize for that. I soured the pot a little bit. Still celebrating, but perhaps less than a yay, more down to a yay. Thanks. All right. The reason that Granger was so insistent on formerly enslaved persons or freedmen, as we often say, I try to be more gender neutral, so I say formerly enslaved persons. Sometimes freedmen will slip out. Is they needed to maintain an economy. And they had already seen the impact on a regional and a national economy from those types of movals and upheavals that I mentioned. So by June of 1865, they say we need to keep productivity rolling, right? Let's look at it from a different perspective. This is the context of Texas. What if we went back and looked at it 6 months prior, looking at Jubilee through the lens of Georgia, and instead of focusing it in the geographical confines of Texas, looked at it through the lens of famous Georgian, and particularly an infamous general in Georgia, General Sherman. General Sherman issues a field order in 1865 towards the end of his march to the sea that had been tacked on to his Atlanta campaign. And essentially, this is an order that is complicated. It is part emancipatory, so there's a celebratory aspect to it. It's part punitive, and it's wholly logistic in that he has a problem that as he's marching to the sea and he is liberating and formerly enslaved persons, he is developing a long tail, and they're following him. And logistically, they're a burden, so to speak, on the Union as they're advancing. And he's also dealing with this problem of deep intransigence in the areas that he encounters with the Confederates as well as sympathizers, family, friends, etc., not truly wanting to surrender. So he turns to this method of scorched earth that I'm sure you're well aware about that I won't spend time to go into here, right? So the idea of having a train of enslaved persons following you is not a feasible one for him. So he comes up with this particular field order that is fundamentally different. They're both flawed, his and Gordon's, but fundamentally different in nature. That is a grounds for celebration for the enslaved in Georgia. In his order, he sets aside nearly 500,000 acres of confiscated land along the coast of 3 states, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. And this is exclusive for Black in settlement. So this land is exclusively set aside for formerly enslaved persons. He promises each family, quote, a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, unquote. Now, does that sound familiar? Have you heard a phrase that incorporates 40? What's that phrase? 40 acres and a mule. So the mule, he didn't promise the mule. The mule came later, so to speak. I don't know exactly how, but it comes later. But this order stipulates that these settlements would be managed entirely by the freed people themselves, right? Let's think about this. So there's 2 orders. One gets a holiday. One gets a celebratory holiday. Everyone goes back to work and is not able to be reconnected to their family. The other one provides the economic as well as the political pillar in preparation for integration into democracy, right? A person that has received a lot of scholarly attention in probably the last decade or so is one that really exemplifies the principles of Juneteenth as well as grasp on to the grounded aspects of Sherman's declaration by taking emancipation as an opportunity to educate, to emphasize economic opportunities, and to assign political responsibilities. Tunis Campbell establishes a court. He establishes a form of a legislature. He establishes several enterprises. This is down in the Sea Islands region of Georgia. And he does this within a year or two of this proclamation, right? He effectively is creating a vision for Jubilee and concretizing it in action. It's not just a celebration, it becomes immediate action. Unfortunately, we know what happens after. If we just had stopped prior to 1868, this would be one of the greatest success stories in American history, the greatest Jubilee story, perhaps in American history, perhaps world history. But the federal government ultimately is going to renege on those promises. It will reconfiscate the land and return it back to the slave owners, the very persons that had been engaged in insurrection. Tunis Campbell, who managed to be elected to the Georgia legislature twice, would then find himself ousted from power and sent to work in a convict labor camp at the ripe age of 64 years old, right? And at the core of what happened and how they were able to dislodge and to destroy this experiment in Jubilee, this realization of Juneteenth, it came through two practices. One was they came through targeted disenfranchisement, restricting access to the ballot for these newly enfranchised, formerly enslaved persons. That was the first pillar of this. The second, it came through a lot of spurious claims of malfeasance, of abuse of power, of fraud, of corruption, etc., that gave them a cover to really, just to say it in simple terms, to lie and then come up with trumped up charges to put him in jail and to expel all others who were part of this Reconstruction class. All right. The reason that I'm bringing him up here is Campbell should be someone that we reflect on in the state of Georgia during Juneteenth to understand that it's not just a celebratory moment, but freedom is very fragile and it has to be tended. Not once a year, but on a day-to-day basis. It has to be remembered, but it also has to be envisioned as something that not only was accomplished in the past, but that we need to tend for as it carries into the present. All right, the last two parts of what I'll share with you today are much shorter. They're only about an hour each. So, so I will be moving a little bit more quickly. But this second section, I would like to think about the evolution. As I mentioned, Juneteenth evolves amidst other attempts to retell as well as to prohibit the telling of narratives that celebrate Black perspectives on the Civil War and its legacy. So in this period that I referred to, I should say, Rayford Logan, the famous Black historian, referred to as the nadir. Immediately at the end of this Reconstruction period, he calls the nadir, that is the lowest point in Black history. All of the gains that had been gained through the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, the economic gains with the land, the self-sustainability, self-determination, all of those were effectively rolled back within a generation. And this same type of retelling, prohibition, rewriting also occurs within the context of history. And I think most of us here are very concerned with history. During the same period that Juneteenth is being explored and expanded, you have a range of holidays that are looking at this episode of freedom through the lens of the Confederacy that are established, not only to surveil, but to prohibit. I won't go into much detail here, but it's a fascinating story. I'll point out just a couple of ones that I think are particularly important. We just finished with Memorial Day. David Blight wrote a wonderful book called Race and Reunion. David Blight is a Yale historian that writes a lot about Reconstruction. Highly recommend his book on Race and Reunion that talks about the history in part of Memorial Day. And he points to this post-Civil War tradition of African-American women who are tending to the graves of U.S. colored troops as well as Union dead and decorating those graves following the Civil War. This inspires a group of women in North Carolina, and they decide to take a step further. They organize themselves into a group known as the United Daughters of Veterans, and they create the first monument to U.S. colored troops in North Carolina at the turn of the century. Unfortunately, in response to that, we have an outpouring of Confederate, I shouldn't say unfortunately. Let me clarify why I say unfortunately. The reason I say unfortunately in response to that is up until that, the Decoration Day had been seen as somewhat a conciliatory day where people could come and to just simply quietly reflect. But that celebration was seen throughout parts of North Carolina, parts of Georgia, parts of Texas as an affront to the Confederate dead. And Confederate commemoration groups, such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, as well as Daughters of the Confederacy, came together to create alternative holidays as well as counter monuments to that practice. The very history of Memorial Day itself evolves to be something that was not explicitly for conciliation and the recognition of Union dead, but also for Confederate dead as well. And somehow, when those two come together, the memory of African American women and the U.S. colored troops and their role falls to the wayside. So to me, that's a very tragic outcome of this particular holiday, that as it becomes more mainstream, the origins of the holiday are forgotten in favor for something that is much more general serving, I would say. Okay, moving quickly beyond that, amidst all of this kind of repression, political repression, economic repression, there comes a history movement. So the positive in this is that a result of this repression of history, a result of this commemorative activity, a result of all of that, there's a history movement that evolves. Carter G. Woodson and others began to document local history as well as national history and develop the phrase of a Negro History Week. This is happening during this period, during this nadir, during this low point. This is happening when the state of Georgia, the state of Mississippi, the state of Florida, the state of Arkansas, the state of Texas are engaged in mass lynchings. This is happening, this counter telling of history. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is in 1939, you see a picture of Opal Lee over there to the right. She's referred to as the grandmother of Juneteenth. In 1939, her house was burned down by a white mob in Fort Worth, Texas. And that same year, there were at least 18 other such incidents in the Deep South. There were 3 lynchings, 2 in Mississippi, 1 in Florida. And there were 18 other, some, not sure exactly, around 18 to 20 attempted lynchings that same year. What we don't have statistics on are how many people had their homes burnt down because they were engaged in what was seen as subversive political activity by celebrating these days, celebrating U.S. colored troops, celebrating holidays that could be seen through the lens of the Confederates as anti-Confederate, right? We don't know that, but we know that there were many. I want to point to something that happened that I think is equally important throughout all of that. There was a coming together and a decision not to turn from the challenge, but to collect and to build upon those challenges. So Carter G. Woodson and others launched in this period of mass lynching a concerted, institutionalized attempt to preserve and to promote Black history, which they've referred to as Negro History Week. I'm going to do a big jump in time to get to the context of another celebration. In 1968, we're all aware, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Almost immediately, the year after his assassination, there was a mass movement to institutionalize his death and his sacrifice in a national holiday, right? Unfortunately, what happens is several years after that sustained movement began, we don't get King Holiday, we get Confederate Heroes Day, which is observed by the mandate of the Texas legislature. But keep your eye on this. Throughout all of this, slowly and steadily, as a result of these grassroots local efforts, the spread of the Juneteenth holiday is moving outside of Texas. is moving outside of the Southwest, is moving outside of the Deep South. So that by 1976, the second largest Juneteenth celebration is not even in the South. It's in Buffalo, New York. It's then closely followed in that same decade by Philadelphia and then Milwaukee and other cities as an underground movement to commemorate this history and to institutionalize these memories that I just shared with you is well underway. So by 1980, when Juneteenth becomes the official state holiday in Texas, there is already, as in practice, Juneteenth's happening all over. So it's just affirming something that was inevitable, so to speak, right? Think about that as we go back and think about the meaning of emancipation. Is emancipation merely a proclamation, or is it the concretizing of the principle in action with the ability of a community to determine its own destiny, its own celebration, and on its own terms? I would argue the latter. In 1983, of course, the King holiday is signed into law after a long lobbying campaign by President Ronald Reagan. And we know most recently, we can all tell our great-great-grandchildren that I was there, I was alive when Opal Lee, this woman here, who saw her house burned down by a white mob in Texas, started walking 2.5 miles a day in memory of the delay of 2.5 years, 2.5 years it took for the news of emancipation to reach Texas. And her walking campaign took her all the way to the White House, where the Juneteenth holiday was formalized and created into a national holiday in 2021. Okay. So this is where we begin to close out, right? We've been talking about grounding and all of this. The last part of this presentation focuses on the relevance, grounded in reference to this theme of how do we make real proclamations? How do we concretize celebrations? And here, these are just some statistics to think about. By grounding this, how does the Juneteenth celebrations of 1866 connect, and what lessons can we learn to them in their relation to the present? In 1866, there was about a population of 4.5 million African Americans. And at that time, they owned less than 1% of agricultural arable land in the United States. Under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, out of all of those who were eligible, only 1,000 applied and were able to get land, right? And the total arable acres that they were able to gain in that period was less than 1 million acres. There were no banks, no Black-owned banks during that period. The Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau that failed a little bit later, which we don't have time to go into now, was important, but kind of a misguided role. But by 34 years, a generation or so into it, in 1900, the population has doubled. The percentage of the population that owns land has improved. 187,000, 12 million acres of arable land, and 4 Black-owned banks, right? The period I cut out, we'll save it. If Trey invites me back, if he's crazy enough to do that, we'll talk about that at a different time. But the good period I didn't put on there because I'm trying to teach you something else today. It continues to increase. And then something happens after its height in the 1940s. In the late 1960s, we begin to see something else happen. That the percentage of the African-American population that has access to land ownership, agricultural land ownership, decreases, as well as the acres, the total acres of land decreases as well. All as the population is growing, right? The number of banks and credit unions increase, but if we bring that all the way up to today, we see that it's definitely a problem. How is it that years later, a smaller percentage after the first Juneteenth of freed persons, formerly enslaved, descendants of the formerly enslaved, hold less land than they did 2 generations prior? It's something that we need to think about, right? something that we very much need to think about. Just as we discussed, one of the earliest concerns of freed persons was to have land, because land was the basis upon which wealth was generated. It was the basis for economic participation in American life, and it was an equal pillar with political participation. You can't negotiate political participation without having an economic basis to state your case, at least not in the United States. So you could not just be pronounced free and not have land. If a rugged general like Sherman recognizes, which was the impetus behind his order, so we should think about, how these concerns and how our celebration should reflect on this particular problem and its relevance grounded in the present. There's a lot to celebrate. So I don't want us to go away from this talk today thinking that we have nothing to celebrate. But when I say Juneteenth is grounds for celebration, I am saying that the event is significant enough that it completely justifies throwing a party, feeling happy about the tremendous sacrifice, celebrating faith that a better day would someday arrive, but also coming to emphasize the hard work of digging into the actual ground, the land, as a foundation and realization for the proclamation of freedom. Because without that, it's just an empty celebratory tone. One of the things that we were talking about last year at KSU during our Juneteenth celebration is the holiday is not yet a decade old, and already it is mass commodified and corporatized. Juneteenth flavored ice cream, Juneteenth t-shirts. This is a Black History t-shirt about the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, but Juneteenth t-shirts. And most of these items have very little to no connection with the communities that they are commemorating. How can we advance in a celebratory tone by turning from the very foundation of the principles of freedom and equality that everyone was aware of in the 19th century? To me, that's a very important question. So as we conclude, I'll just point to 3 takeaways. That different folks, Black, white, brown, etc., communities, whether you're in Texas, whether you're local, whether you're international, we all have different responsibilities towards the maintenance of freedom. But it doesn't take care of itself, and celebrating by itself is not enough. It should all be grounded in the local needs and experiences. Each Juneteenth celebration should push the ball forward. One generation removed from slavery, one generation removed from slavery, were able to raise enough to purchase land communally, to set the precedent for the establishment of banks, land banks, learning how to read. I can't imagine how it would be to have been denied legally the right to education, the right to read, and to begin to learn to read in your 50s and your 60s. Can you imagine that? One generation did all of that. So we too should think about Juneteenth, regardless of our ethnic or racial background, as how we can aim to be better off the next Juneteenth than we are in the present. We should not look up and look at land loss. We should not look at the very idea of freedom lost next year and say, well, it was good while we had it. But Juneteenth should be an annual time to both reflect and to act, as well as celebrate the hard-fought battles for freedom. So thank you for listening to me today. And I'm excited to be here. As I mentioned, I'm hopeful that we can have a little bit of conversation if we still have enough time, Trey. And again, thank you. Yes.
Going back to the slide you had on Tunis Campbell,
Mm-hmm.
I missed what was his position? What was he involved with?
Tunis Campbell was a baker. He was a baker. And he was an educated baker who relocated And he became the unofficial mayor first in this region, but then he was elected to the state legislature. But for me, the part of his life that I find most interesting is how he was able to create on a grassroots kind of like microcosm, a fully functioning democracy full of people who had been denied education, people who have been denied access to land, capital, etc. He was able to create a self-contained version of the United States. It had its own legislature, it had its own judiciary, and it was self-sustaining economically. They were engaged in the kind of like the staples of the region at the time, which included cotton, among other things. But they were also engaged in a sustainable kind of I shouldn't say informal, but sustainable self-contained economy. So he was checking off all the boxes that people like Gordon would have wanted him to check off, but he was not going to concede kind of like the ability for persons to move around as they wished. If you're really interested in his life, there's two great books on it. One is called Freedom's Shore, and the other one is called A Nation Under Our Feet by Greg Hahn, I think is his last name, H-A-H-N. Great books that really talk about this kind of important figure that has been forgotten. But I think that there's a lot that we can learn from him in the present. Yeah.
Is that going to be one of Seneca Village?
My name is Seneca. So yes, I think there are some comparisons to Seneca Village. I do not know as much about Seneca Village as I'm aware of this one, but there's throughout this period there's a lot of kind of autonomous communities. The closer that you are to kind of secluded areas, the more likely those experiments are to be a success. So the whole Gullah Geechee project in coastal Georgia and the Sea Islands of South Carolina are able to be maintained because they have somewhat of that isolation. The more that you get kind of like integrated into the mainland, like Seneca Village, you then can sustain it for a little while, but then you lose it, right? So to me, it's a fascinating period. There's also an Africa town that comes about a little bit later in Beaufort, South Carolina, or Beaufort, South Carolina, depending on how you want to pronounce it. There's a more modern village that tries to do this. To some extent, it succeeds, and other it fails. That's the Ayatunji village there. But all of these have, I think, at their heart, these are experiments to address this idea of freedom. Not just in a celebratory tone, not just buying our fireworks and going out on the 4th of July and then calling it quits after the barbecue, but to really engage with, okay, if this is what freedom is, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How do I see it? What does it taste like? And I think there's lots to learn in all of those experiments.
So, to make sure I'm doing my part, are there books that we should be reading, or basically how do white folks not mess this up?
Well, I went to what I thought was a great Juneteenth celebration in Georgia last year in Sandy Springs. And it was in one of my earlier slides there. And what I saw at that celebration is I saw a lot of Black folk who are engaged, as always, my people. We were celebrating, we were commemorating, but I also saw a lot of alliances and allies who were there, who were showing up. And I think the best thing to do in situations like these is to have dialogue, because I think each community is going to be a little bit different in what it requires. On a related note, when I was in Buffalo, there's the huge Juneteenth celebration. I don't think I mentioned it in the talk. I used to live in Buffalo, New York, and there was a local historical organization called Afro-Americans in New York Life and History, or Afro-Americans rather, of the Afro-American Historical Association of the Niagara Frontier. They published a journal called Afro-Americans in New York Life and History. And what they did, I think, I joined that organization, and I think it's a really great model to answer your question. What they did is they created a local historical organization that was focused on preserving local histories and then integrating that into various community activities. So they had an annual family history dinner. They supported these local events. They recognized people in the community who were preserving history. They would be here. They had a regional library. If we had a branch down here, Trey, we would be here today, and things like that. But one of the things that I found very effective was during the family history dinners, it was a time for people to come and to share their family histories, but also to share and to learn. And one of the things that we often find is that the dividing line between white and black is very thin. And I've been doing some genealogical stuff as well as some DNA stuff. And the more we listen and the more we hang out with each other, you will likely find some cousins and some kinfolk. So I don't want to be pat to your question, but I would say the thing that's needed most is just dialogue and listening. And there are models, despite kind of what the very loud propaganda around us that is constantly telling us we cannot get along. There's lots of models with people who are quietly doing the business of freedom every day and who are getting along. So dialogue and listening, I would put at the center of that.
I know this is about history, but it also sounds like it's about economics as well. So what advice do you give to the Black community in terms of advancing economics, land ownership in this community, which is ultra-conservative, not a lot of gifts handed out, and I don't mean gifts by money, but just promotion of certain movements. So is there a national movement that the leadership in this Black community can look to see what those people did so many years ago?
I love that question. So I would say begin local with what your interests are. I'm interested in cemeteries. So this was something that I have not always been interested in. It's just something that recently I've become involved with. There are national organizations, there are state organizations, and there are state funds to preserve cemeteries. Why cemeteries? That's kind of morbid, right? But there are many unmarked cemeteries or cemeteries throughout the state of Georgia that are in disrepair. Many of them are cemeteries that in turn formerly enslaved persons. And if they're left kind of just to fall to nature, they end up being under the parking lot of a McDonald's or Big Lots or something. And I think that's disrespectful to the past. And we lose that history as well as the lessons. So I'm working with organizations locally to preserve those cemeteries and to think of kind of mixed use purposes of that space. So like in the example in Houston, why do we need an Emancipation Park, right? Well, there are some benefits to privately owning and pooling one's resources to maintaining private space that I think we're beginning to see in the present more and more, that state funds, federal funds cannot always be counted upon. So one thing that we're doing is we're working on a project. I say we, a friend of mine at Kennesaw State, Teresa Roschek, she's an archaeologist, I'm a historian. We bring kind of different skills to the approach. I think, Joe, you know about what I'm getting ready to say. But thinking about ways that we can preserve cemeteries and the histories that accompany those cemeteries, but then using that space regularly for other activities, right? So that's one way. To the economic question, the issue of land banking, I think is an important one, particularly in a state that is dealing with a lot of sprawl right now. There are land trusts and there's models for land trusts that we can consult. Additionally, there is also a need for more credit unions, which, this is not entirely in my wheelhouse, but they serve a very important function that I think if a generation once removed or twice removed from slavery can pull together their funds, so can we. So an organization that I have to be careful because this is being recorded, so I'm part of the lawyer brain is turning on. But there is I won't say some of the negative things, but I'll share that. There is a organization called Greenwood that is a combination of African Americans who are interested in finance, who are interested in banking. And it's a virtual bank that they created that was based largely around, inspired, I should say, on the history of Greenwood. For those of you that don't know, Greenwood was a thriving economic district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was destroyed. And what at that time was the largest race riot in American history, maybe world history, we don't know. But it was a thriving, very wealthy Black business district. What these group of people have done is using that as their inspiration. They've created an online banking model that you deposit your money into. They use that to leverage how they support and finance other social projects. And I think they've spread out. I think they originally were focused only on African-American stuff, but there's some also Latino initiatives now connected to that as well. So that I think is a very concrete model. It's not a perfect one, but I think it illustrates that same spirit of grounding the celebration in like action. What can we do that concretizes our aspirations for freedom? So those two examples, I'll leave you with. Thank you for that question, Ernestine. Yeah, Joe.
I was going to mention that project with Dr. Ratchett.
Yes.
Last semester.
Yes.
Brought out the point that you made about the focus of different groups, because we discovered by looking at the land plots in Cobb Historical Society, and is that it was actually a church and a plantation graveyard that were side by side. And as we worked through cleaning them, we're finding the headstones, these different backgrounds, and if they could lay in the dirt together, why can't we live together?
Yes. I'm going to riff on that just a little bit. So this is this project. It's called the Jonesville Cemetery. Jonesville was a community kind of adjacent to Marietta, Georgia. And it was a community that after emancipation, during the same era that we're talking about, where do these people go? They stay there. And Joe's pointing to, this was a multiracial community. There were Blacks, there were whites that lived together. The question, I think I mentioned it when I met your class that day, but the question that has been itching my mind is not only who lived in that community, but how did they live and how did they negotiate kind of this Reconstruction era politics of that period? We know one of the people from that community that was formerly enslaved went to Liberia, and he was part of colonization efforts in Liberia. And he's writing back his former master of the things that he's doing in Liberia. So it's a really interesting story. We know the people that stayed there established the church, the Mount Sinai Church, and the church thrived, it grew, the community grew. But during World War II, that entire community was displaced as a result of Air Force base that was built there. So, I mean, that raises, as Joe knows, that raises all types of questions in my mind. Was this community being punished for being an interracial community? And it became kind of like on the chopping block, you can have that area. The church was physically preserved and relocated to another part of the Black district in Marietta. But there's a lot of tied up history. There's Black history, there's white history, there's national history, there's local history, there's international history. And all of it gives us a different slice of the flavor of emancipation, and what it means. So I'm excited about that. We're still working on it. And I'm super excited that Joe is here and share that question with us.
And 4 times a year, there's a cleanup project, and everybody is invited. It's at Dobbins Air Force Base. You need to get clearance 2 weeks in advance. But the sensation you have after you've taken this overgrown area, and suddenly you see it cleaned up, and you see the parameters of the gravestones and all, it just gives you a wonderful feeling of honoring the people that have passed.
Oh, yes, absolutely. All right, thank you.
Dr. Vaught, thank you for bringing that to us today.
My pleasure.
Great information, and certainly it's something for all of us to think about. will say too that it's interesting that we ended on this topic. There are several people in this room, myself included, that are big cemetery nerds.
Really?
And when I hear more about your project down in Marianne and how there's a local cemetery that we've been working on lately that kind of fits the same kind of type or same kind of setup.
Excellent.
Anyway,
Excellent.
Call me crazy, but we'll have you come back.
All right. Thank you. Thank y'all. Thank y'all.